Our afternoon panel is going to be called The Assad Regime and the Evolving Dynamics of the Opposition. The subtitle is Who Supports Whom and What Do the Rebels Want? We have three very distinguished panelists to give us their opening formal remarks on these important questions. And then we will entertain a couple of interactive questions with myself and the panelists, and then open it up to a discussion with the audience. So let me first go on to introduce our three panelists. Our first speaker is Stephen Starr, who is a freelance journalist and author of the recently published book, Revolt in Syria, Eyewitness to the Uprising, which he amazingly sent to press just this last spring and summer, and is already here for you to purchase outside at the table. Stephen lived in Syria for 5 years until last February, where he reported on the revolt for the Washington Post, the Times of London, foreignpolicy.com, the Irish Times, and other publications. He's now the editor of the Near East Quarterly and is currently a journalism fellow at the University of Toronto's Chenoweth School of Global Affairs. Our second speaker is Pierret, who is a lecturer in contemporary Islam in the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. He is the author of the just published Religion and the State in Syria, the Sunni Ulama for Coup de Revolution, and he's also co-edited a volume called Ethnographies of Islam, Ritual Performances and Everyday Practices. His own research interests include sectarianism, Islamic activism, and the management of religion by Middle Eastern states. Finally, our third speaker will be Radwan Ziadeh, who was a key figure in the Damascus Spring, which is a period of intense debate about politics and calls for reform in Syria after the death of President Hafez al-Assad in 2000. He went on to direct the Foreign Relations Office of the Syrian National Council, which is the main umbrella for the Syrian opposition, and he's the founder and director of the Damascus Center for Human Rights Studies and co-founder and executive director of the Syrian Center for Political and Strategic Studies in Washington. He's the managing editor of the Transnational Justice in the Arab World Project, a senior fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and a fellow at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. His most recent book is Power and Policy in Syria, Intelligence Services, Foreign Relations, and Democracy in the Modern Middle East. So as far as the rules of the panel go, although I myself am often an advocate of nonviolent resistance, I must say I'll be ruthless with the clock. So each speaker is going to be 20 minutes, limited to 20 minutes, so that we can maximize participation from the people who have taken time to attend this conference. At about 18 minutes, I like Fernanda's idea of giving you a signal to wrap it up, so I'll do that. And then I'll ask each speaker one question to start off our conversation, and then we'll open it to panelists. So with no further ado, I'd like to welcome to the podium Stephen Starr to introduce the topic of Syria's societal cleavages. Who supports him? Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to speak a little less academically than was the case this morning, I guess, based on my own kind of personal experiences on the ground there for 5 years. I moved to Syria in 2007, and for the first kind of year or so worked for a regime newspaper, which is affiliated with an Arabic kind of version of the news as it was according to the regime's perspective at the time. That was illuminating because from the very beginning I had a really good insight, I think, into how the regime was able to portray its own perspective, kind of internally and also regionally and more so internationally as well. Operating as a journalist was something really quite different, particularly obviously when the revolution started from March 2011. But you know, in terms of having a unique kind of aspect of what was happening on the ground, we do, I feel, at least in the English language media, we hear an awful lot about policy debates, what the US should do, what NATO should do, the UN and so forth. But we hear very little, I think, of what Syrians themselves feel and think and believe should happen. My experience has been that it's a very, very divided society. A lot of people support the regime still. A lot of people, a growing number of people support the revolution. Perhaps the largest societal group, or if we can actually
put these people into groups, is the silent majority, where people don't support the regime or the opposition. But stepping back, I guess, back to kind of March 2011, it was generally Sunni towns and villages and neighborhoods that took to protesting against the revolution. But I don't think there was a kind of a specific sectarian reason for this. I think the first reason was that there were economic kind of issues and concerns and aspects for this. There was a significant drought that took place in the eastern part of the country, in the Jazeera, from 2008 till about 2011, which forced about almost 1 million people off the land into the poor suburbs, where they could buy at least kind of cheap houses or rent kind of cheap accommodation. And these are the same areas that we hear of today, places like Salahuddin and Aleppo, places like Douma and Harasta in Damascus, and also in Dera. I think it's a second reason that the majority of people who are protesting and who are involved in the revolution are Sunni is because 3/4 of the population is actually Sunni. So by default, by numbers, it's going to be Sunnis generally who are involved in the revolution. And also, where people didn't take part, where people didn't oppose the regime, no violence took place. And that doesn't matter if it was a Christian neighborhood or a Sunni neighborhood. If you didn't oppose the regime doesn't care what religion you are. All it wants to do, essentially, is to maintain power. I guess there are two kind of main kind of cleavages in Syrian society today. One was kind of discussed, I guess, in detail this morning, was the sectarian or religious kind of cleavage. A second, I suppose, is something that is a lot less kind of discussed, is the urban-rural kind of divide, which I'll get to in a little while. I want to use an anecdote of how the rural Alawi community in Syria interacts with the regime. I heard a story of a friend who was visiting an Alawi family close to the city of Tartus, in the, I guess you could call it the Alawi stronghold. In the middle of the night, apparently there was a news or word got around that there was a group of cars with armed men traveling towards Tartus, and the idea was that they were going to try and, I guess, take control of the city center. So this family got in their car, essentially, drove down the mountain, and along with, I guess, the majority of the people in the town and in the neighboring Alawi villages had this huge rally in the middle of the night. Now, there was no, from what I've deducted, there were never any cars with armed men arriving at the city who excuse me, attempting to take over the town, and I guess it's something of a Tahrir kind of moment was perceived of what they were trying to do. But it was just this instant kind of reaction that we have to back the regime, that it is in our interest to back the regime, that any opposition to the regime had to be kind of quietened, I guess. For Alawis living in Damascus and Aleppo, I don't think we can say exactly the same thing. I think because they interact a lot more with Sunnis, with kind of people who are drawn to the major cities for university, for work, and so on. They have a slightly different opinion, I suppose. And one thing also I think we hear very little about is the power of the government propaganda in areas that the regime still controls. This is a significant factor in how the regime is still able to keep control, particularly of Damascus and Aleppo, I suppose, western Aleppo at least. And these kind of urbanized Alawis are kind of, I suppose, convinced by the regime's media, in that the regime says it has carried out reforms, that there's a new constitution, and that most importantly, this revolution is not a revolution at all. It is a foreign conspiracy against Syria. I think the regime has done very well in kind of using the word, instead of using the word kind of Syria, they use the word Syria for when they actually mean regime. So when there's attacks on Syria, they actually mean that there's attacks on the regime itself. A lot of kind of people buy into the idea that there's going to be elections in 2014, and that who knows, maybe there can be a new president other than Bashar al-Assad. This is something I heard from a government official, I think in the fall of 2011, so about kind of 6 months into the revolution. So even from at that stage, there were, 2014, we're hearing more about it today, I think. The election, the presidential election in 2014 would be something that they would use as, a force of legitimizing their role. Many other religious minorities don't support the regime, but they fear kind of opposing it. And I think we see this kind of, particularly in the English language media again, that it's a Sunni revolution and that minorities support the government's 100%. It's not the case at all. My experience of kind of interacting with Christians in Syria is that they kind of, they look at these pictures of Bashar al-Assad all over the cities, all over the countryside, and they know that it's wrong, and they say that, this is unnecessary, and it's not right, and it's almost like, that Bashar is God, and obviously we've heard how the Shabiha has tried to kind of enforce that idea too. Of course, not kind of all minorities support the regime itself, and one minority, I guess, that has been known for its opposition to the regime is the very small Ismaili community, which have been kind of, when we hear very little from them, but they have been kind of foremost in their kind of opposition to the regime, to whatever extent that is. The second other point that I mentioned is this urban-rural divide, and I think this is an extremely important factor as well. I think it's important today because I think it's holding back the revolution. I do think kind of, the religious tensions are a greater long-term threat to the country as it stands. There's a huge gap, I think, between the populations of Damascus and Aleppo and people from the countryside. The kind of indigenous populations and families and communities, let's say, take Damascus for example, they look at the people from the countryside in, I guess, a rather negative way. I mean, people of Damascus, they can spend $5 on a coffee any night of the week. They go to restaurants pretty much as they like. They have chauffeurs and that, they shop in Western styled malls in Damascus and Aleppo for the most part, I guess. And they speak a little bit of French, and they get to travel to Turkey once a year, and they're pretty well off. These people want no hand or part in the revolution, to the extent that they don't want to, protest on the streets of the cities to oust the government. Many of them don't like the regime at all, but they don't want to get involved in the dirty work. And I want to quote Syrian analyst Sami Bayat, who I think he left Damascus quite recently. The Damascus mindset traditionally has been this: don't get us involved in the dirty work of revolution. We'll come up with a political solution, a prime minister and a government afterwards, but we don't want anything to do with the strikes, the violence, and so forth. More recently, another kind of cleavage, I guess, if we can call that, is almost the ghettoization of the country, in that because there are so many checkpoints right around the country, be they kind of in rebel-held areas or in government-held areas, it's the civilians fear moving out of their town, I think, because of these checkpoints. And obviously, when you pass through a checkpoint, as I did dozens of times when I was in Syria, they check your ID, and they want to see what province you're from. So if your ID says that you're from Deraa province and you're in Damascus or you're somewhere else, these governments or regime security officers are going to kind of, they're going to be more interested in where you're going and what you're doing. The consequence of that is that people stay in Deraa as opposed to going to Damascus for work or as they would in their everyday life. As to get back to the silent majority, this, it's impossible to put figures on who supports the regime, opposes the regime, or what number of people are on neither side. But for the most part, I think, the Syrian civilians that I know and have interacted with, first and foremost, want security in their lives. They want electricity. They want to be able to, let their kids walk in the streets and play and so forth. And they associate the revolution with this deep instability in that they can't travel to the countryside. They can't go to Tartus or Latakia, to the beach. They can't, particularly speaking of the people in Damascus, these kind of wealthy families, they can't go to their villas in the countryside. And for them, for the people that have not been directly affected by the regime's actions, the revolution is this kind of huge inconvenience to them. And the sooner it's over, whoever wins, they don't particularly care, the better it is for them. Now again, I need to kind of qualify that. If you speak to Syrians from Deraa, or if you speak to Syrians from Salahuddin in Aleppo, who have directly felt what the regime's actions, where their houses have been destroyed, their families have been killed and tortured and that, excuse me, they have a very different perspective on what they want to happen. They want the regime to fall as soon as possible. They want NATO intervention right now. They want America to get involved in any way, shape or form it can. They don't care who does it. They want the regime out. So, this is another kind of cleavage that we find amongst many others. I think that the violence has hardened attitudes between and among these very kind of disparate groups. I think my experience, at least for the first kind of, 4 to 6 months of the revolution, there was this fantastic opening of dialogue between people in Damascus, in kind of Damascus countryside where I lived. People were kind of debating what the regime should do, if the regime should stay or go. People were kind of, it was democracy at work almost. But after a certain period of time, it was kind of the case that this guy or this friend of mine, well, he has a different opinion to me, so I'm not going to call him up and meet him to go for coffee because I don't want to hear about that. And I'm not going to speak to the friends who share the same opinion about the revolution, about the regime as I do. And obviously the violence has hardened attitudes and destroyed a lot of space for this dialogue. And I think this is in the kind of the medium to long term, this is a significant threat to peace in Syria. Of course, the Assad regime is almost entirely responsible for this. I think a question to ask today is how the Syrians deal with each other following the inevitable fall of the Assad regime. This is something I could have mentioned in my book, that someday the regime will fall and there will be 23 million people left, angry, sore, hurt, very, very, with a lot of deep-seated kind of hatred, I guess. Bashar will be gone, and the people around him will be gone, but these people will still be here. And something that kind of, provoked my thought, I guess, was that some friends, their son was, some Christian friends, their son got in a fight at in the school playground with another kid because the other kid said something bad about the president. I mean, these kids were, I think, 10 years old. I mean, is this the next generation of the divisions that we have between different religions and groups? And I guess finally my experience of living there kind of for 5 or so years is that people don't generally like to take responsibility for their actions, which is going to be something that they will have to do, I think, in the future in order to maintain the kind of the Syrian state as it is. But obviously, with the Assad regime in place, there's absolutely no space for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for your remarks and for staying on time. So our next speaker is Tomas Pierret, who's going to discuss the Islamization of the Syrian revolution, origins and prospects.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Erica. So the Syrian uprising never was a secular movement in the strict sense. most of the first demonstrations took place in and around mosques. Muslim clerics quickly became some of the most visible spokesmen for the movement, and religious slogans were heard in the very first demonstrations. However, during the first months, this revolution was certainly not an Islamist revolution. The religious features I just mentioned were, in my view, a kind of natural expression of the culture of a predominantly pious and conservative society. But there was no clear Islamist agenda being formulated. No one was speaking of establishing an Islamic state or implementing Sharia. This situation has partly changed over the last year. So we are now faced with several political and military coalitions that put forward a distinctly Islamist platform. And these forces have been gaining ground at both popular and military levels. So in this presentation, I will present some of the factors that account for the rise of these Islamist forces, which will provide me with the occasion to present the main actors on this Islamist scene. The first factor I'd like to address is the agency of political returnees and the new political entrepreneurs. You probably know that since the repression of the Islamist uprising in Syria in 1979 and 1982, the country was almost totally void of any form of organized Islamist political activism. And from that perspective, the current conflict has been an opportunity for Islamists to build or rebuild an influence inside the country. The most prominent example of that is, of course, the movement of the Muslim Brothers, which, as is well known, is one of the most influential forces, if not the most influential force within the exile opposition, within the Syrian National Council, and still maybe less in the Syrian National Coalition, but are still very influential in it. Inside Syria, it's a totally different picture. They were almost starting from scratch. By March 2011, they had no organized base inside the country. And it's only after several months into the uprising that they started to send members into liberated areas in order to rebuild a foothold. And it's not necessarily easy for them for several reasons. One of them is what I would call a class and cultural issue. The average member of the Muslim Brothers is a very educated member of the middle class. That's not necessarily the case of the people who live in these, the first liberated areas in the province of Idlib or Aleppo. Financial resources of the Muslim Brothers may be overestimated. I'm not sure they are that impressive. And all of that maybe account for their mixed success at establishing their influence over the military scene. They follow two kinds of strategies. The first strategy is what I would call a hegemonic one. So the goal was to establish some form of military coalition which they would fully control. And that coalition was called the Committee for the Protection of Civilians, which was established in February 2012. That was not very successful. It was never a heavyweight on the military scene. It has lost some of its most powerful components over the last months. Maybe because they're simply not able to provide enough funding to keep really strong control of all of these armed groups. And so they've been following in parallel another less ambitious strategy, which I would call buying shares in various military organizations. So they're not able to fully fund and control these organizations, but they give some support in order to have some leverage over them. And they've been involved and supportive of very diverse armed groups. I mean, not necessarily people who follow their ideological line, but would say like the FSA, strictly speaking, but also maybe more Salafi groups. In terms of agenda, I mean, it's very clear since they're, of course, the Muslim Brothers have a clearly Islamist agenda. They're speaking of Islamizing laws. That's in the 2004 platform. But they've been somewhat downplaying that agenda for obvious reasons. They are dealing with secular opponents among the exile opposition. They are dealing with Western governments, and they don't want to alienate these partners. So I mentioned earlier the fact that one of the problems of the Muslim Brothers is maybe this discrepancy in terms of class, identity, and culture, which maybe prevent them from reaching to a broad popular audience inside Syria. It must be noted that they don't have any charismatic figure, no popular or populist preacher, and this probably created some space for people belonging to other Islamic trends who are maybe feel more comfortable at addressing very popular audiences. I think in particular of a Syrian but Saudi-based Salafi TV preacher called Annan el-Arur, who is, so he's been based in Saudi Arabia for several decades, he's an exile. He's mostly known in the West as an anti-Alawite agitator, which I don't have the time to elaborate on that, but I think is rather undeserved. But there is no doubt that he's been important in Islamizing the discourse and the symbols of the revolution. Recently, in his TV program, he encouraged Syrians to write Allahu Akbar on the national flag and say that anyone who opposes that is a heretic. It must be noted that this preacher is not behind any particular movement, and in fact he seems to be mostly supportive of the defector officers, so to a certain extent the more secular component of the insurgency. Probably, I think, because he's very much in line with Saudi official Saudi policies, and I'll come back to that soon. Just a word about, I mean, these are what we could call returnees, or at least the Muslim Brothers. They were influential in the past, and they're trying to rebuild their influence inside Syria. We have completely new political movements who are seizing the opportunity of the revolution to establish a presence in the country, like the Syrian National Movement of the Ahmad al-Rashid, who is the former vice dean of the Faculty of Sharia in Damascus, who is supporting several armed groups inside Syria. And we have also a phenomenon that is presently marginal, but it's a trend that's interesting to follow. It's regional political entrepreneurs. So a party was recently created. It's called the Syrian Ummah Party, so the party of the Islamic nation or community, and which was presented as the extension of a network of parties with the same name, Ummah Party, which has been established in the Gulf, first in Kuwait in 2005, and then they have branches in the Emirates. And they represent the kind of most liberal wing of the Salafi scene in the Gulf. And so it seems they're encouraging Syrians to establish a similar organization. I come now to a second factor that account for the rise of Islamist forces and for the rise of Islamist agendas, which is the establishment of coalitions by armed groups. Many armed groups from the onset were displaying an Islamic identity through the choice of their names, maybe their rhetoric. But it's usually once they started to form coalitions that they put forward distinctly and clearly Islamist agendas, that they started to talk about implementing Islamic law, establishing an Islamic regime. And I would say that the most powerful non-FSA military coalitions have been embracing that kind of agenda. For instance, the Front of the Revolutionaries of Syria, established in June 2012, the Front for the Liberation of Syria, established in September 2012, the Syrian Islamic Front, created last month. Another interesting consequence of this process of unification of armed groups is that some of them have seized that opportunity to set up a political wing. So this profiling themselves not only as military actors, but also as political actors for the future. And here I think of a coalition called the Front for Authenticity and Development, which was established last November. It's predominantly Salafi. It's most influential in the East, in Deir ez-Zor. And they present themselves as the first organization in Syria that combines military and civilian political activism. Third, another factor, which is the civilianization of the leadership of the insurgency. So the early generation of military leaders were de facto officers, not necessarily convinced secularists, but they had been socialized within the Syrian army, which is a strongly secular institution. These de facto officers have been unable to keep control of the whole insurgency because it was spreading very rapidly, because they were lacking external logistical support from the outside, or because they were not necessarily the most charismatic leaders on the ground. And so we've seen the emergence of quite powerful civilian leaders, civilian leaders volunteering as military leaders, many of them with an Islamic background. Just give you an example, Abu Isa, who is the leader of Sukur al-Sham, one of the armed groups that has taken over the airport in Taftanaz yesterday, who is the son of an Islamist who was killed in the 80s, and himself a long-standing Islamic activist who spent several years in prison over the last decade. And there are many other examples like that. Fourth factor, of course, very important, which is the issue of funding. It is often argued that the Islamization of the Syrian insurgency owes much to the fact that state funding is mostly provided by Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And I kind of disagree with that. First, Qatar and especially Saudi Arabia have quite consistently supported efforts at uniting the rebels under the aegis of de facto officers, rather than civilians like the people I mentioned earlier. So they have quite consistently supported, let's say, the lesser Islamist side of the insurgency. So that if you look at the coalitions they've been supporting, they were always headed by defectors from the Syrian army. In Idlib, for instance, it is reported that the main recipient of Saudi state funding is maybe the least Islamist of the three main local armed groups. It's called the Martyrs of Syria. There is another issue, which is that the total amount of funding from Saudi Arabia and Qatar is not that impressive, and it's certainly not matching the needs of the rebels, which led many of them to turn to self-help. They've been trying to raise money through private networks, and most of this money has been collected and channeled by Islamist organizations. The Muslim Brothers, of course, but also maybe more importantly, networks, private networks in the Gulf, which are often supportive of Salafi groups. And when I said the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, but maybe Kuwait, Kuwaiti Salafis have been the most prominent and maybe most influential financial backers of armed groups in Syria. And these people, of course, have a clear influence on the agenda of Syrian groups. I think here of, for instance, there is a fundraising committee based in the Gulf called the Islamic Committee of Syria, which is a Salafi network. They're a major source of financial support for humanitarian, maybe and probably military activism too in Syria. And they have publications in which they very clearly warn the opposition that implementation of Sharia is a red line, and they should not retreat from that goal. So this is likely to have an impact given their fundraising capacities. A fifth factor, there are 7 as a total, is of course the rise of sectarianism that's been dealt with this morning. No need to insist on that. The cause of the rise of sectarianism is very obvious. And this is a trend that favors groups that are perceived as associated with anti-Shiite militancy, because they include large numbers of people who have fought in Iraq, chiefly the well-known Jabhat al-Nusra, but also other groups like Ahrar al-Sham, and even other groups who claim the influence of sectarian ideologues like Abu Basir Tartusi was a jihadi ideologue who has quite strong, fierce writings against the Shiites. Okay, so this is favoring this kind of groups. as is the rise of, and this is the sixth factor, the rise of anti-Western sentiments among many Syrians as a result of the disappointment at the Western refusal to support the insurgency. And the belief, which seems substantiated, that the US is pressuring its allies in the region in order to limit arms deliveries to the opposition. And this has benefited groups like Jabhat al-Nusra. Just think of the widespread discontent among the Syrian opposition, including among non-radical Islamists, at the US decision to include the movement on the terrorist list. It's also maybe benefiting a lesser-known organization called the Islamic Liberation Party, Hizb al-Tahrir, which had always maintained a limited underground presence inside Syria, despite state repression. And it's a group that's characterized by its very maximalist agenda. They want the restoration of the caliphate now. And I don't know if they're very influential, but they've become increasingly visible, especially in the north, in the province of Aleppo. They've been organizing demonstrations under that slogan, restoration of the caliphate. And they're probably benefiting from anti-Western sentiments at two levels. First, they are the most distinctly and most consistently anti-Western Islamist movements in Syria. That's interesting. They're not sectarian. They're very upset with the West. So they're different from Jabhat al-Nusra. They're not much interested in Sunni-Shiite divide. It's very much anti-Western. And also, I think maybe a growing number of people are ready to follow their agenda because, I mean, maybe they know that it's a red flag for the West, and maybe a few months ago they would have been reluctant to adopt such a maximalist agenda. But now they think, well, who care? I mean, why should we care about what the West think? It makes no difference anyway. And the seventh and last factor, which is the breakdown of law and order in parts of the liberated areas, and especially in the province of Aleppo, where some FSA battalions have been involved in looting, ransoming. And this has favored Islamic forces for two reasons. First, because there is a widespread perception that Islamist battalions are more upright than non-Islamist ones. In November, there was a demonstration in Aleppo where people were shouting that the Free Syrian Army are thieves, we want an Islamic army. And maybe for obvious reasons, if you think of a group like Jabhat al-Nusra, which has so many fighters who are actively seeking martyrdom, so when you're thinking about martyrdom, you don't have much time to think about looting apartments. That may be one of the reasons. And besides that, there have been initiatives aimed at protecting civilians from possible exactions by rebels. And in these initiatives, it was very obvious that religious norms and figures, i.e. Clerics, were often seen as the best way to protect civilians. So there were fatwas issued by local Sharia committees against looting, against ransoming, against arbitrary arrests of people. There were some committees were established under the name of Committee for the Promotion of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice. And it was seen maybe here in the West as a kind of copy-paste of the Saudi institution that has the same name, which is in charge of enforcing an Islamic lifestyle. But it seems that the real driver behind these initiatives was rather to have a trustworthy organization that would be able to keep in check some armed groups that were involved in exactions against civilians. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tomas. And our final panelist is Radwan Ziadeh, who's going to talk with us about revolution in Syria, the struggle for freedom in a regional battle.
Thank you very much. Thank you again for Nadir and Danny and for inviting me to speak here. I will change a little bit actually my presentation, but I used to talk in my paper more about the regional implication and international implications. Since the first panel has talked much about that, and I think I'll provide here at least what I see that as an inside account for the Syrian revolution, which I think which dragging the Syrian to do the most difficult struggle for democracy in the region. Syria hasn't in the history since maybe it get independence from the French in 1947 had paid such a price, which estimate according to the UN more than 60,000 has been killed. We have to put in our consideration that Syria has some democratic institutions in the past, in the 50s. Has a very democratic constitution in 1950, which now became the main demand of the Syrian opposition, that to consider the constitution of 1950 as the next constitution for the Syrian future, of course with some amendments according to the change in the history. And with the same time, the political structure at that time, the pluralism and the political parties, different political parties, the election, all of that has been swept away when the Ba'ath Party came into power in 1963. And this year now, we have half a century Syria lived under dictatorship, where there is no political parties. We have in Syria 3 newspapers. We all call them that. We have 1 newspaper with 3 editions. And then 1 state media, there is no private TV or something like that, which more the authority of the security forces, which anyone can go to this. Happened in 2005. Myself, I have travel ban in 5 security branches. If I need to travel even that to Lebanon, I have to get a permission from all of these 5 security branches. And that's reflect exactly when you have such a difficult authoritarian regime, the answer obvious that there is no organized political opposition. It's difficult for the opposition to organize, even that to exist. Most of the opposition been killed in the 80s or in prison or living in exile. Myself, I've been enforced actually to go in exile in 2007 when I have interrogated by the head of the security, who's still right now actually Major General Ali Mamlouk. He told me that this is the last time you will visit us as a guest. Next time you'll be in a prison. Clear for me, it's much better to go outside. And after that, the security put the travel ban on my sister, my brother, the whole family. Even my friends in Syria, they sent a message. They said that we cannot be friends on Facebook anymore, because the threat they have, if they have friends of Radwan outside Syria, the threat they have inside Syria. And that's all the situation actually. Then you have the revolution, the uprising in Tunisia and Egypt, that's put a new future for the Syrians. They know exactly that the army is different and the security forces, they would deal with them with a different way, but they believe that they have to start something. And this is when especially when the Egyptians, they succeed actually to oust Mubarak, the Syrians, it was obvious that the Syrian will be the next. The revolution started from Daraa, with the southern city. With that, this is the question of the sectarianism, or it's not an issue at all. Because if the issue of the sectarianism should be, the revolution starts from Hama, where that's the base of the Muslim Brothers, or it should be started from the Kurdish area in the northern part of Syria. But started from the southern city of Daraa, where actually the most military officials from Daraa, and even that's among the vice president from Daraa, and the head of the security forces from Daraa, and those until now who's not defected from the Assad regime yet. And this is why it's quite sometimes the media, Western media, give portrait about Sunni uprising, about Alawite, is not this is the case at all, especially for the Syrians. And then when it started from Dar'a, it started as a peaceful revolution. And they insist about the nature of having peaceful demonstrations, not only in Dar'a, then swept away to Douma, to other areas in the north, in the coastal part in Latakia, in other parts. Even that the regime from the day one trying to say that this is an armed group, tried actually to give some arms to the protesters and give some pictures to them where they have handling arms. They throw the arms away because they know exactly the history of the 80s. And they know that this is what the regime they need. And they insist having peaceful demonstrations basically until August 2011, which 6 months, which left more than 6,200 has been killed. And the regime decided at that time, when we have in the city of Hama more than 500,000 demonstrating against the Assad regime. Of course, all these peaceful demonstrations did not achieve anything from the Assad. There is no radical change from or the nature of the Assad regime. It's true that he come up with a new constitution. He left the state of emergency, which now Syria under state of emergency under 1963, but still the security can shoot anyone in the street. They can arrest anyone without arrest warrant. They can do whatever they can. This is why the Syrian, they don't believe that the Assad is serious or has any meanings to do any political reform. And when the Assad involved the security, then the army in the killings, still the Syrians, they try to do, to play in the pillars of the Assad regime, especially the army. And there is many chanting that the Syrians, along with the army, because they saw what's the army in Tunisia and Egypt, when they sided with the people, that's at least to protect the state institutions. And this was one of the scenarios. But unfortunately, the army based and been instructions by the Assad regime as very loyal to him, especially the ruling elite within the army, which until now, it has been 2 years, the army has been involved day by day by the killings of the Syrian people and did not take any step aside from what's happened in Syria. What's allowed actually the Syrian uprising to be as an armed revolution? I think two things. The first thing, the brutality of the Assad regime, which never, as the Syrians, expect such kind of brutality. The first, we have, among the 60,000, we have more than 6,000 children under 18 years. Among them, actually, many been tortured until being killed. The case of Hamza al-Khatib, the case of Tamir al-Shari, who's 14 years old. He got 18 bullets in his head at military security. And the case of Riyad Matar, as example, he's in my hometown in Daraya, he's one of the icons. He come up with the idea to give the red flowers to the security, to the army, to send a message to them that we are not in a fight with you. Then the Air Force security, they detained them. 3 days later, they deliver their body. They actually remove their, they torture him and until he's killing, and they deliver the body to his mother. And that sent a message to the Assad, the brutality. Then, of course, the Assad used to target the Syrians where we are in funeral, and they target the hospitals who are actually treating treating the injured people. That's when the Assad never respect even that the Geneva agreements or the Geneva rules it's allowed the uprising to be much more stronger in a way that, with the same time, much more in the direction of the radicalizations against the Assad and maybe. The second issue about the frustration from the international community. It's the Syrians, they saw what's happened in Libya. The Security Council adopted the resolution 1970 after 11 days, what's happened in Libya, which refer the crimes against humanity to the International Criminal Court. The Gaddafi continue his campaign against his own people. The Security Council again adopted the resolution 1973 after 30 years, after 30 days, which allow under Charter 7, Article 42, which use all the necessary measures to protect the civilians. This has never happened to Syria. The first actions by the Arab League on Syria after 6 months, where they come up with the statements about what's happened in Syria. Then they come up with the idea of Arab observers, then the UN observers. And the Syrians felt that the international community is playing, rather than taking responsibility to protect them. Because everyone knows what's happened in Syria, that the security and the army is targeting and shooting its own people. Why need to send Arab observers? Then we need to send the UN observers. Then they fail to do anything. Then that's create a gap exactly between where the international community stands and where the situation and the reality on the ground. And this is, of course, push the uprising and the revolution to be an armed revolution, and even that they know that the number of casualties will be much, much higher, since there is no support from the international community, and there is no ability to have such of organized insurgency inside Syria. There is no safety zone, and even that the Free Syrian Army, which now succeed to liberate many areas, but there is geographically are not connected. And this is why quite difficult to have a central command to do all of that. With this is again create what I call the Syrian tragedy. With this is a reflect between where the international community stand. Even that you heard what they call themselves as friends of Syrian people. They have 4 meetings, the last meeting in Marrakesh, and they still talking about the peaceful transition, where the Assad is maximizing, using according to the US, of course, according to the NATO, using the Scud missiles against his own people, and using the Air Force day by day. Which now, and this is why the Syrians believe that this is became as international conspiracy against the Syrian people, not against the Assad regime. Because before that, the Syrians thought that, okay, the international community will not allow the Assad to use the Air Force. The Assad regime used day by day from 29 to 35 military Air Force raids every day on different cities in Syria, which left. And the targets on this, the bakeries, like what's happened in Homs and in Aleppo, which left thousands of Syrians just waiting on the lines to get some food. Those became targets of the Air Force. And also with what's called the TNT barrels. All these details, maybe for the Western audience, is not unimportant. But of course, for the Syrians, really important, because they saw how much the brutality of the Assad regime. The TNT barrels actually is not an missiles or rockets, just something rubbish. Put TNT with the sum of small pieces of irons. And when they put it from the helicopters, that's fallen down, and this small pieces of irons goes at least 1 kilometer, and they can target. When I visited Aleppo last month, I visited a family who lost 18 members just because this is small pieces of irons getting from the Air Force. which that's never been used in the history in the past, only maybe in Afghanistan during the Soviet war on Afghanistan. And still we have these TNT barrels dropped by the Assad Air Force every day, and we don't see response from the international community. Then I will end here about the fear about how the Syria will be in the future. Despite of all of the frustration and despite of the painful that the Syrian is feeling right now, they still believe that the only outcome to have a democratic state, even that they have different groups with the Free Syrian Army, with different Islamists or Salafists, but still the consensus among all of those that we have to protect the unity of Syria and the unity of the Syrian people. We know that Assad is investing in to have Syria to be in the civil war, because at least he can keep a position there. But the Syrians, they are full aware of that, and this is why it's trying as much as they can to address the issue of the sectarianism, which I think is still Syria is not really in the situation of the civil war, because at least there is no air force being used in any civil wars over the world. Still, actually, 90% of the victims are civilians. Even that's according to the UN, the statistics, they said it's 1,800 are free Syrian army fighters, and 2,000 killed by the Assad, and all the rest are civilians who's been killed by the indiscriminate killings of the Assad regime and the Air Force. But until now, we don't see any targets on the Alawite community, despite of the Free Syrian Army control many areas, especially in the areas where there is some Christian or Alawite villages, but there is no targets. There is no indiscriminate killings by the Free Syrian Army on those villages and towns. And still, actually, we see more an involvement from the minorities in the Syrian uprising, especially from the Christian, from the Druze, and from the Alawites. Even but what's happened exactly that most of the murders, let's say, or the security officers are Alawite. And those will be targeted by the Free Syrian Army is not because they targeted because they are Alawites, because they are the head of the security forces, the head of the army who's actually killing them and shooting them. And this is something we have to distinguish because they don't killed because they are Alawite, and that goes long. Just I will finish here by the two cases which very much telling exactly about the nature of the Syrian uprising. The case of Basil Shihada, he's actually a Syrian filmmaker, teach at New York University. He's from Damascus. He decided actually to finish his fellowship and to back not to Damascus, to the Homs, where Homs at that time has it became the icon of the armed revolution. And he left Damascus to the Homs and left under the Baba Amr and other, was under everyday bombarding by the Assad regime. He's of course belonged to the very prestigious and well-respected Christian family in Damascus. And he's been killed in Homs by indiscriminate killings. Has become one of the icons of the Syrian uprising. The Assad regime even that refused to have a funeral for him in Homs or in Damascus. And I just talked today to his sister and his mother to invite them to conference we are holding at the end of this month about transitional justice. And they are too much like to play a role in giving an idea that not all the Christian with the Assad regime. The same case of the student Lubna Mirai. Lubna, she is an Alawite student. She's from Latakia. Her mother actually refused that for what's many of the Alawites being in the security and in the army targeting the Syrian citizens. And she opposed what her husband is doing. What's happened that her husband, who's an Alawite, delivered his wife to the security. And of course the security, they execute her. And the woman was, the daughter was shocked how her father actually killed her, his wife. And now she's left and living in Turkey. And she's became day by day involving about the dangers of the Assad regime, even that's on the Alawite community. Because those Alawite who are opposing the Assad regime under huge threat of the Assad, because the Assad regime need to send a message to all the Alawite community, this uprising is targeting you, and it's trying to marginalize all the Alawite community to be in one block supporting the Assad regime. And this is why I see any Alawite figure who's taking distance from the Assad regime, who's being critical against the Assad regime, is being now in prison, like Abdulaziz Al-Khayr and others, my friend Kamil Abbas and others, or maybe being enforced to leave the country. This is why always we say that this uprising is for dignity and having democracy in Syria, and hope that this can achieve its goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our panelists. Before I ask our panelists individual questions, I've been asked to announce that Oliver Kaplan, who is a visiting professor here this year, actually delivered a presentation last night called Surviving the Syrian Civil War. And it's about how civilians have adapted strategies to protecting themselves against violence from all sides. Anyway, if you missed his talk, he has the slides and is willing to distribute them and discuss these types of strategies with our audience members. So please see Oliver if you're interested. So I have 3 questions, one for each of our panelists, and I'll start in the order of the presentations. So my first question is for Stephen, who mentioned the 2 interesting different divisions that he sees in Syria at the moment. And you really focused in on the urban-rural divide, and you do so in your book as well. It's long been said that in wars like this, whichever side is superior at dividing and ruling the other side is going to emerge ultimately victorious. And at least in the opening months of the uprising, it seemed that the Assad regime was quite good at adopting the divide and rule strategy, at least acting as if there were deep sectarian divisions, even if there weren't, acting as if it was a foreign conspiracy, even if it weren't. And so if the regime has played this game kind of skillfully, what do you think can be done by members of the opposition to try to sow divisions within the regime?
It's a good question. As was to move back a little bit, as was mentioned earlier, the regime has been prepared for this for 40 years, for this moment of revolution, but at the same time, I think it was taken by surprise when it actually did start in Daraa. What can the opposition do to divide? I think they need to speak to leading figures in from minority religions, and that doesn't mean speaking to Alawis who already support the revolution or Christians who already support the revolution. You don't need to convince those people of anything. You need to convince the people who are afraid to change for whatever number of reasons to do so. I mean, it's in terms of the chief families in Damascus and Aleppo, how can you get them to change. I mean, I think it's extremely difficult, and I think, with all respect to the political opposition based overseas, they have very, very little support on the ground from what I've seen and experienced based on my own views only, on who I've spoken to and so on. I can't speak for everybody, obviously. You know, they want, lots of the people who don't support the regime and who are afraid of the Islamist elements of the revolution want the opposition to come up with something. But I guess for the most part, they see at least that the opposition hasn't. They're not quite sure who, you know, when they speak of the opposition, who exactly is that? When you talk about the Syrian National Council, well then, you know, the major families in Damascus would say, well, that's a cover for the Ikhwan, the Syrian, the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's really quite difficult. I think that maybe possibly, I mean, I'm not no political analyst, but I guess the best, perhaps the opposition's best strategy is to simply point out the facts as they stand and to point out exactly what the regime has been trying to do to this, I suppose, silent majority of people, or to minorities. But they need to speak to. I mean, they need to speak to the priests of the Christian communities in Marmarita, in Homs, in Sednaya, in these kind of large, kind of mostly Christian towns, the Vilat area in Aleppo. I don't know how they can do it, whether they call them up on the phone or over Skype or a satellite phone, or actually go and visit them. They need to speak to them and bring some kind of mandate to them, I guess.
Okay. My second question is for Tomas, and it's kind of informed by the notion that the groups that help to win revolutions are not always the groups that benefit from them in the long run politically. We've seen this in a variety of different contexts. Iran comes to mind, where there was an Islamization, as you would put it, of the revolution sort of during the end game, but it was a much more popular uprising before that. The same thing could be said about some of the other Arab Spring cases as well. And so my question is, to what effect is this Islamization of the revolution going to lead? Is this going to help the revolution to succeed? Or is it true that it's kind of been hijacked prematurely by these groups? And if so, what could be done to take it back from them?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's been hijacked. I mean, if this revolution succeeds in the end, the Islamists will have, they will be responsible for that to a large extent. This airport that fell in the Idlib province yesterday, most of the fighters were Islamists. They're really paying a heavy price to military victories of the opposition. So you cannot accusing them of hijacking anything. They're really part of the process. Is it helping the revolution? I think it has it's both maybe positive and detrimental. Of course, this is scaring the minorities, but at the same time, I think one should not overstate their importance. Let's be honest. Speaking to the Christians is very, in itself important. Reassuring them is good. It's a desirable thing, but it won't change anything. That won't turn the balance. We're speaking of less than 5% of the population, probably. They have no political weight, no military weight. So whatever the Christian think won't change anything. That won't make the revolution successful. Yeah, of course. I think the only minority that matters on the ground is the Alawite minority. But I doubt that it would be enough to talk to them, to convince them to give up their weapons. The Islamization, I don't know, has allowed the rebels to reach out maybe to new allies. I don't know if it's true, but there are reports about some cooperation between the rebels in Damascus and some people who are loosely affiliated with Hamas among the Palestinians, who are now fighting on their side against the army.
Okay, great. For Radwan, my final question is about the push for more international involvement in the Syrian conflict. Now, it's true, as you say, that there have been tragic consequences to the lack of international involvement. But one might also suggest that, at least from an American perspective, in recent times, one thing that the US government has experienced is that in some cases, the only thing people hate more than a lack of US involvement is US involvement. So the question is precisely what kind of international intervention is being requested at the current time by the opposition. And the second part of that question is, what are the potential risks and costs, not just to the interveners, but to Syrian civilians for that kind of intervention?
Yes. Just if you allow me a few things about the rulers and the urban areas. When the Ba'ath Party came into power in 1963, he came because actually the rural areas, especially in Hama suburbs and in Hum suburbs. And those areas became right now the heart of the uprising against the Ba'ath Party. And this is, we always say that this revolution against the basis of the existing regime. With the same time, that's no one actually in having key position in the government or in the regime belong to the urban areas. I mean, if you can name all the ministers or the prime ministers who hold positions during the Ba'ath Party, none of them belong to the aristocratic families in Damascus and Aleppo. They actually love to stay away from the Assad regime, and they do business. They have some connection with the Assad regime to ease their businesses to build, but none of them are interested actually to play a role, except with some maybe individuals like Abdullah Dardari and others. And that's give you a sense that these regimes became always be seen as strange of the Syrians. There is no huge support in the rulers' areas, and there is even that when the urban areas has no much support. But of course, when the uprising became an armed revolution, not the urban sons, they never will fight actually, will do that. The second issue about the silent majority, how much the percentage in the Iranian revolution, which among the greatest revolutions over in the history, which was the largest population participated in the revolution at that time, 10%, the French 2%. Always there is a silent majority, but that doesn't mean that the silent majority is supporting the Assad regime or, no, even that's because the brutality of the Assad regime, we see more people actually want the Assad to live in any cost, in any way. When I visited in Aleppo and I met with one of the families, they lost 3 children actually because they are in line of the bakeries and they target. And for the father, even that he's not belong to the opposition or for him quite difficult to understand why his own Air Force target him just to get some bread. For him, quite difficult to understand. Even that's why I lost 3 of my children just because I'm waiting to get some bread. This is the brutality and discriminate killing of the Assad regime pushed more and more actually people to be in the revolution side. Then regarding the intervention, no one from the day one actually, since the uprising started, we always say that the Syrian revolution has 3 pillars. One of them, we don't need any kind of military intervention. Of course, that's changing on August, where the number of the casualties been rising rapidly. As I said, until September, more than 6,200 has been killed. And that's people, they start talking about protecting the civilians. But no one is calling, until now, no one is calling for force or troops on the ground. But at least to avoid, to neutralize the Air Force. not to allow the Assad regime to use the air force. At least there will be an equality in the battles between the Free Syrian Army and the Assad forces. But still the Assad forces has very advanced position because the air force. And this is why I think the most important thing and the priority now to have a no-fly zone, or at least to provide the rebels or the freedom fighters with the Free Syrian Army with the anti-tanks and anti-missiles.
Okay, I think we'll open it up to audience questions. If you would, and if you're able, please come to the podium, identify yourself, and then keep your questions on the brief side. Who's first?
My name is Eugenio Cusumano, and I'm a visiting scholar here at the Korbel School. I've heard a lot of interesting, often horrifying things today. One thing that I would like to hear more about is the role of the Syrian military. We have seen that the military has played a key role in the Arab uprising. In cases such as Tunisia and Egypt, where the military has sided with the rebels, or at least has refrained from basically repressing the revolts, we had a relatively peaceful regime change. In others, such as Bahrain or Syria, we had the military repressing the revolts and obviously producing gross human rights violations. So my question to the audience is, do you think that the loyalty of the military to the Assad regime is finally weakening? And if not, why not?
It's very important question because we need to study more about the nature of the military in all the Arab Spring, in Tunisia and Egypt, and in Syria and in Yemen. When we compare Yemen and Syria, it's very important because in Yemen what's happened that the army is split. Half of the army, they support the revolution, the uprising, and the other half of the army, they support the President Ali Abdullah Saleh. What's happened in Syria, the structure of the army is being built that you have the key figures who's very loyal to the Assad regime, belong to the Alawite sect minority. And those actually still very loyal to him. This is why there is no split in the army. And this is actually our tragedy exactly. Last week, the third man in the army defected. Is a Major General Abdullah Shlal, who's actually the head of what's called the Military Intelligence Police. That's who's, but he defected by himself. Even that he cannot bring even his assistants with him. And this is the questions. What we have in the Syrian army, we have a collapsing day by day. And that's explain what's called, I called always the civil war within the army. Because there is no split in the army, at least you have a balance. You have day by day collapsing, some people defecting, other people still fighting with the Assad regime. Would that make the number of casualties, or even that the number of soldiers being killed day by day is very high. When the Free Syrian Army captured the Marj Sultan military base in Damascus suburb, they discover mass grave, which include 92 soldiers who intend to defect from the Assad regime. The Assad, they killed all of them. They put them actually just in graves at the airport. This is why we need to do more study exactly about how such regimes or authoritarian regimes been able actually to use the state sources like the security and the army to build such, I don't call it as very loyal, because we have huge defectors numbers from the army, but at the same time is not split, or at least still the key figures is very loyal to him.
Either of you like to comment?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of points. I think the National Army is essentially a militia with aircraft, military aircraft capabilities. I think for the most part the only active divisions are the 4th Division and the Republican Guard, which are almost all entirely made up of Alawi officers and soldiers. I think my understanding at least is that the majority of the remainder of the battalions and divisions in the army have been confined to military bases since early on in the revolution. A couple of my friends have been stuck in bases all across the country. They have no mobile phones. The only TV they can watch is Dunya or Akhbariya, the regime TV channels. They are watched intently. And I think from the beginning, when protests happened, before what I just said became the case, from what I understand at least, was that soldiers were sent out to shoot at the protesters. And directly behind the soldiers were the security agents. And it was essentially a case of the soldiers shoot at the protesters or the security shoot at them.
Quick remark here. So we've spoken a lot about the sectarian dimension of the army, but it's also important to stress the fact that there are so many relatives of the Assad family in the army. I mean, especially in the higher hierarchy. I mean, that's what keeps the army, I mean, to a large extent loyal to the president. And that's why, speaking of getting rid of Assad alone, that's not very realistic, because it's much wider. I mean, you cannot have a scenario like in Egypt where the top generals decide to drop Mubarak because keeping him will put the whole regime in danger. That's impossible in Syria. I mean, there are too many sectarian, clanic family solidarities that prevent this kind of scenario.
Okay, go ahead.
My name is Basman. I am a PhD student here. My question to Radwan. Did you notice any differences between how the Christian minority behave and how the Muslim minority behave in reaction to the revolution? And my second question is how you perceive the reaction of the Arab world. Like someone said, Syria is the heart of Arabism is surrounded by Arab without Arab. They have received a lot of support from the Arab world. And my third and last question is, in your talks with foreign officials, like state officials, how much you see they are motivated by strategic interests, and how much they are motivated by human rights norms as RPG and military intervention?
If I can just repeat the questions for the video. The first question was how Radwan sees the different reactions of the Christian versus Druze minorities. The second question was, what is the reaction of the Arab world to the conflict? And the third question was, in his discussions with State Department officials and other government officials, does he see their reactions to the conflict and their policies around it emerging more from their strategic calculations and political calculations, or more from human rights or democracy impulses?
Let me start with the third point. After the atrocities, and exactly what's in the first panel mentioned, after the atrocities in Kosovo, in Bosnia, we thought that the international community is built and institutions will not allow such atrocities to repeat it again. Like in July 2002, we have the International Criminal Court. And in 2005, we have the responsibility to protect the UN principles. But Syria teaches us that all of these lies. And exactly this is what the Syrians believe right now. Even myself, which I used to teach some of this stuff. I don't believe it anymore. Because usually it's what's the drag the states to do something, their interest rather than principles of human rights. If we compare between Libya and Syria, it's right that there is an agreement at the Security Council in Libya, but more important, there is oil in Libya. At least 90% of the oil who coming from Libya, that's feed Europe. And if that's Libya dragged into the long time struggle then that will threat to the stability of the oil prices in Europe. But they see, all those countries see Syria as differently. And this is why maybe now we have to think again about all of that. With the same time, push us to believe that responsibility to protect, it's a doctrine, it should be implied in all this. I believe that when states committed crimes against humanity or war crimes or genocide, it lost its sovereignty. We should not consider these states as a sovereign states. And according to the UN, of course, Commission of Inquiry, they mention quite numbers of crimes against humanity and war crimes committed by the Assad regime. And this is why this state is no more longer we should deal with it as a sovereign state. The second issue about how the Arab states, with that, we should not forget that now who's the countries who's been accused that supporting the Syrian uprising have the best relationship with the Assad regime: Qatar, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. The Qatar invested in Syria, Turkey, they invested in Syria more than $2 billion. And they have strong relationship. The Turkish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Daoud Dogli, he told me he visited Assad 62 times. And he visited his own town 3 times. They have a strong relationship, but at least Turkey, after 5 months, decided to take the side of the people when the refugees coming on, and they have with all the stories about what's going on in the country. With the same time, with the Saudi and in the Qatari. The Qatari, the Emir of Qatar, has 2 very luxury palaces in Damascus. Each one cost at least $3 million. I mean, those, of course, then the Qatari decided to stand with the Syrian people. I mean, that doesn't mean they have their own interest. Each state has their own interest, but at least they have some principles have to stood up. And the most support and the most arms who's coming right now, not from the Saudi or from the Qatar, from Libya. Because the Libyan, they know what's happened, and they see themselves actually the brothers of the Syrians, because they have the same type of tyranny and the regime, and they feel responsibility to help the Syrians as much as they can. Then the first point regarding the minorities, we should not put the minorities in the same categories. I mean, the Ismaili minorities, with the small portion of the Ismaili in Misyaf, those, they have long history opposed the Assad regime. This is why the Assad regime appoint the minister Ali Haidar, who's right now what's called the Minister of Reconciliation. His son is being killed by the Assad security because he's supporting the uprising from the day one and actually pushing to have demonstrations in Misyaf, the hometown of Ismail. Then the second level we have Druze. The Druze, they concentrate in the area called Suwaida. This Suwaida has been actually forgot by the Assad regime. There is no any infrastructure. There is no any education system. There is no. This is why usually they are not happy with the Ba'ath regime, since they have some problems. And in the Suwaida or the Druze area, they have demonstrations every time, and they are now active with the Free Syrian Army. In the Christian, it's different story. The Christian, after 5 months, they come up with the statements. They called, we support the Assad regime, because they feel that they are the minority and they need at least the Assad, they can offer them at least some support or protection. But later on, when the Assad regime continue with his brutality, and don't forget the Christian, they lived in coexisting with the Syrians, with the Sunni or what's called whatever, for a long time, for centuries. And as one of the Batraks told me that we are actually with the majority. It's clear we will not have alliance with other minorities. We should have alliance with the majorities, because those who will be protect us for centuries, and they will protect us in the future. This is why after 8 months they issue other statements. They need stability, but they never mention the Assad regime. And now we have strong contact with the Batrak of Aleppo, with the Batrak of in Damascus, and in many cases they are the Christian community. They are very, very active in the humanitarian assistance. Well, this is never been actually in the media, but they are very active. In the Christians became, or the churches became the medical hospitals, and became they open its doors to treat all the injured people from the Free Syrian Army, from the civil activists. This is why we don't have any fear, but the fear we have actually about the future of the Alawite community. And this is the questions, and we're having conference about transitional justice at the end of this month in Istanbul. We're trying to bring religious leaders and community leaders from all the cities in Syria, and we're trying to bring the victims of the Syrian families who have played a role in the Syrian uprising, to build at least a consensus about the needs to keep the unity of the Syrian people. This is something, if the Syrians lost it, they lost Syria.
Next question, please.
Yes, I wanted also to ask Radwan Ziadeh a question. You spoke movingly about the disappointment with the international community's response. And I think that to understand the lack of sufficient response, one has to put two factors into one's understanding. One, you mentioned oil. Syria has no oil. The scenes of intervention in the region have been Libya, Iraq, and the threat to Iran, all oil-producing countries. The other size, Syria is very big for a successful international undertaking. Kosovo was small, and it was governed by an alien elite from Serbia. Chechnya illustrates the problem of size. Russia was too big to take any account of the kind of crimes and atrocities that they committed in Chechnya. So it seems to me part of the tragedy of Syria is this combination of no oil and size. I don't know what you think.
It's just to start, how sometimes actually some statements from the international community became not only helping, being insulting. When the Victoria Nuland, she's the spokesperson of the State Department, she cautions the international community about atrocities or the massacre will be taking place in Aleppo. And the journalist asked her, what you will do? She said, our hearts with Aleppo. We don't need your hearts. Everyone knows that. And also there is, in another press conference, she's been asked about why you don't provide the Free Syrian Army with the anti-crafts, at least to protect the civilians in the areas being under control. And she said, we don't need more militarization of the conflict. With the same press conference, she confirmed the Assad regime used the Scud missiles. The Scud missiles, this is the maximizations of any conflict to use. And with the same time, she said, we don't need more militarizations. This is some press conferences became insulting for the Syrians, because it gives us pictures of the international community enjoy watching, and enjoy Syrian being killed day by day by the Air Force, and the massacres became only numbers. every day have a massacre. Yesterday, as example, in the city of Al-Raqqa, 40 been killed, among them 8 children, because the Air Force of the Assad regime. The difficulties of having military intervention, beside all of that, there is no oil for the Syrians, of course, in Israel. Because the questions, of course, everyone now maybe see that the Syrians, they are destroying their own army. And that will serve the interest of Israel, will serve the interest of any enemy of the Syrians. And this is one other question. The Syrians believe right now that the international community wants Syria to be destroyed, not be able to overcome all of this crisis, all of this tragedy. But the most difficult, we always say, the consequences of not taking any actions. The inactions have consequences. Now, the State Department listed Jabhat al-Nusra as one of the terrorist organizations. You said in the previous panel, and in every meetings with the State Department in the 2011, you have to do something, otherwise the militarization, the Islamization is taking place in Syria. They said yes, and they know that, but there are no actions being taken. Everyone knows, predicted actually what we've been seeing in Syria before, but no explanation why the State Departments or the US did not take any actions, why they left the situation to be in a mess like this in Syria.
Just a remark, I mean, of course I won't discuss the issue of oil, I think it's very obvious. Regarding this issue of size or military power, I think there's been a tendency in the West to overstate the military capabilities of Syria. Okay, maybe at the start it was a bit difficult army to deal with, but now, I mean, the Air Force is completely outdated. Much of the air defenses have been dismantled by the rebels. It's true that at the beginning the army was located in many parts of the country. It was maybe difficult to distinguish between the army and the rest of the population, but now they're besieged in many bases, especially in the north, in Aleppo. I mean, they concentrated in military bases. They have become very easy target if there was any intention to intervene. So I think it's no longer an issue of possibility or...
Can you come up, Ricky? Come up there. Yeah.
Thank you. Rafib Joijati with the local coordination committees in Syria. And it's really a comment to Thomas, because you said that from the beginning of the revolution, it was really not a secular movement. And you said as evidence of this, the demonstrations would come out of mosques. And I do want to point out to those who are not familiar with the protests in Syria that public assembly is illegal in Syria. And the only way for people to engage in any sort of demonstration, peaceful or otherwise, was to gather in a house of worship. And that is why the overwhelming number of protests began from mosques. They also began from churches. I do want people to understand that. Thank you.
Thank you for your remark, and that's absolutely correct. When I say that it was not secular, it's because I don't think that, in its majority, I don't think Syrian society is secular. And in my view, there is nothing wrong about that. I think most Syrians are religious people. I think it's not wrong.
But you can be religious and still be secular. And I think this is a characteristic of the Syrian people, that we have many conservative Christians, many conservative Muslims, but this does not mean they do not respect the rights of others.
But I mean, you don't need to be a secular to respect the rights of others. I mean, it's a matter of definition, but when I say that someone is religious or pious, or even an Islamist, he doesn't mean he wants to exterminate minorities. I mean, that's a completely... I mean, this is sectarianism, or which is different, or extremism. Yeah, I hope.
The best comments I heard about that, when George Sabra is now the head of the Syrian National Council. He's a Christian Orthodox. And in one of the interviews, actually, in the CNN, she asked him about, you don't fear, actually, in these demonstrations because they are coming from the mosques? And he said, thanks for the mosques, because they're allowing this revolution to happen. Without the mosques, there is no way for the Syrians actually to get any gathering or legal gatherings. He said, thanks to the mosque.
May I add something?
Sure.
Yeah. Just to go back to an anecdotal kind of incident, I guess, that I saw when I was there during the revolution regarding the Christians and Druze, and it's just an anecdote. We went to a restaurant one time on the border of Lebanon, Syria, and Israel, the Golden Heights, in the summer of 2011, and it was all patrons there were either Druze, Alawi, or Christians, and about halfway through, the regime music started up, and all this Abu Hafiz stuff went on and on and on. I mean, it was, ingrained into the party issue. About the oil thing, and I'm absolutely no expert in this. I do believe that there were plans, I think, to create a line from Kirkuk, I think, or from Erbil, one of the northern Iraqi cities, right across Syria to Tartus, which already has, I think, pretty extensive oil refinery capabilities. So I think if the idea that the sole motivation for intervention in Libya was for oil, and it's not for Syria, I'm not so sure that's actually the case. And as for George Sabra, he's from a town I know intimately well, and he's regarded by the Christians, not all Christians, but the majority of Christians in that town, that I know at least, as being a communist and not a Orthodox Christian.
Please.
I want to bring, my name is Usama Baby, and I want to bring the subject about Iran. The United States is worrying about the nuclear capability of Iran, and they are trying to develop nuclear power. The United States is against that, and they want to limit the power of Iran. There is a treaty between Iran and Syria, and there comes Hezbollah, who's mentioned by the United States as a terrorist organization. And they are helping, and they are friend of Assad. You would think that to the best of interest of the United States is to split Syria away from Iran. You would think that the United States will be serious about helping the Syrian revolution. But yet, we don't see that at all. The question is it due to Hillary Clinton's special position? Would that be changing in the next administration? Or are we to think that really the United States is not serious about preventing Iran from having nuclear power?
Okay, so the questioner asked whether the U.S. interest in preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons is linked to this conflict, and if so, why don't we see a more serious U.S. effort? And if, when Hillary Clinton is replaced as U.S. Secretary of State, do we expect more U.S. effort?
I don't think that the issue of Secretary Clinton, I met with the Secretary Clinton twice, and she said she was clear actually, she's very interested to move on. But I think the problem, and still right now in the White House, the position of the US did not change until from August 2011, when President Obama, he said Bashar al-Assad has to go, and they focused on the sanctions, and since then, the White House never moved 1 inch on this position. Despite all of the situation involving in Syria, still the White House repeat the Assad has to go, but do nothing to make this happen. They still counting the days of Bashar Assad, but they don't do anything actually to help the Syrians with exactly what the Syrians want right now. This is why I hope that it's serious became Rwanda Obama, like what's happened in Rwanda on Secretary Clinton. I just finishing book about the U.S. administration, how to deal during the Clinton administration with the Kosovo. We see the same right now. You have a democratic administration, division within the Security Council. Then the U.S. have to do something outside of the Security Council. They should not wait until the Russians change their position. Because I led two high opposition delegation to Moscow, and we met with the Lavrov twice. You feel that's the same position they have with the Assad regime. They're repeating the same propaganda, the armed gangs and all of that. We don't support the Assad, but at the same time, privately they support the Assad. Last month, I met with the Syrian Prime Minister Riyad Hijab, who defected, and he told me, Riyad Hijab, in the last meeting with him with the Assad told him that today we received 2 shipments of ammunition from Russia for free. That's a message. It's not about he trying to tell them that don't feel fear or all of that. We still, the Russians will support us to the end, not actually for an economic deal, for any, they're giving us guns and ammunition for free. This is why I think that if the Obama administration put Syria in next administration as a priority, they have to have a solution for that. We have right now more than 3 million displaced inside Syria, 1 million refugees. With the cold winter, we see actually a very tragic photos and videos about the Syrian refugees in Lebanon, in Jordan, and in Turkey. This has to have an end. If the situations continue like this, I think we will have a wave of radicalizations, not only in Syria, but in the whole region, not only against, will be against the West and against the US. And this is something we've been we've been caution the United States about it.
I think we have time for one more question, and then maybe we'll have some closing reflections from our panelists. Please. Can you come up to the podium? Sorry. Oh, gosh. You're just not hearing it well. Okay. Sure.
We keep seeing news items about the massacres, bombings, shootings, snipers all over the country. And what I can't figure out is, where is Assad getting all of these soldiers? And I know, Stephen, you were saying that there's the Republican Guard and maybe the 4th Battalion. Who are these soldiers? Are they doing this willingly? Are they under threat? Do we know? And I just saw today an item in Aleppo, 9 soldiers defected. So we're seeing a lot of defections every day. So who are these people who are shooting and firing and bombing and sniping every single day? And are they doing it under threat of their own lives? Are there enough Alawi soldiers and officers to keep this going?
Yeah. First, you have to understand the size of the Syrian army. The Syrian army, it's considered one of the 16th in the world regarding the size. You have 400,000 soldiers. And since the uprising started, Bashar al-Assad issued an order in April 25th, 2011, which did not allow any soldiers actually to finish his military term, his military service. This is why the number is increasing. And he used all the state fund, the state budget, to fund the military and the security. This is why, despite all of the defection from the Assad army, you still have many soldiers. Now, they usually how they work. They send a group. It doesn't matter if especially in Idlib or in Deir ez-Zor. Most of the soldiers, as exactly Stephen, that they never been in contact with their families. I have a case with one of the soldiers when I was in Syria. He defected. He doesn't know that his father, his mother has been killed. He has been fighting with the Assad regime for almost 9 months. Never has a cell phone or a phone to contact with his family. When he defected and the Free Syrian Army facilitated to contact with his family, he discovered that his father, his mother been killed. And this is, you have larger. Then we come up to the most loyal groups or battalion to the Assad regime, which the Republican Guard and the 4th Division. And the other group, which now the most loyal, which we call the Shabiha. Those 100% Alawite militia. Those who's actually joined the military or joined the army on own structure. They don't have the instructions from the army. Those, they do the most atrocities or the most, let's say, Al-Hawla massacre, Al-Qubair massacre. Al-Hawla, when they slaughter 214 among 76 children, according to the UN, 51 children under 2 years old. And those who slaughter them, those, of course, the Alawite Shabiha who's doing that. And this is the fear we have if those, how they made. The types of the brutality been torturing the Syrian and slaughtering them, we never seen only maybe in the Balkans during the war there. But and this is why still you have a group who joining from the Alawite who have some fear that if the Assad fall, not only will massacres will be killed, they will lose all the benefits and the privileges that the Assad regime provided. Don't forget that the Alawite is very poor areas in Latakia and in Tartus, and the Assad regime invested and put them all in the state. If in the state employees, according to statistics, state employees, you have the Sunni 74% of the Syrians population. But in the state employees, you have 62% are Alawite. You see that they are 12%, but because you have the health sector, all the nurses are Alawite, all the teachers, especially in the northern parts, are Alawite, and they get a lot of benefits and advantages. And this is the fear if the Assad fall, all these privileges and this is the explanation. You will see actually many Alawite physicians being torturing their own citizens because this is the fear. The regime played on the sectarian division among the Syrians, and to be honest, he succeeded. He succeeded to marginalize all the Alawite community about that. When they are losing territories right now, still now there is a debate among the Alawite community, okay, then the Assad, where he will lead us? This question is very important because that will lead a debate among the Alawite community that if we stay with the Assad, then we'll all go with the Assad. Otherwise, we have to take distance. We have to have a discussion with the Syrian people about the future of Syria.
Great. I think I'll entertain a couple wrap-up comments from Tomas and Stephen, and then we'll take our break.
Yeah, it was just a comment and another answer to your question. Maybe we should look at the problem the other way around. Assad doesn't have that many soldiers. The Syrian army is supposed to be, I think, per capita, it's one of the 10th largest armies in the world. They're unable to control a zone, between Deraa and Aleppo, which, the axis around which most of the fighting takes place. Forget about the desert. It's roughly the size of Estonia. I mean, it's very small. And they're unable to keep control of that with maybe 300,000 soldiers. That's ridiculous. I mean, in no country with a reasonably cohesive military, you would be faced with such a situation. Look at what happened in Aleppo. Salah ad-Din, the neighborhood, the famous neighborhood, how many times did they claim they would retake it from the rebel? I mean, it's still under rebel control, and they will never retake it. I mean, they have very, very few reliable soldiers in Aleppo, obviously. They've never been able to reconquer permanently any neighborhood of the city.
Thanks. Stephen?
I guess to that point, you don't need very many people to fly a bomber over the bread line and drop. It doesn't take too many people to do that. And also the Shabiha issue is something that I guess we haven't spoken about much. Several times during the revolution, a number of prisoner amnesties were issued. And I've been told, I can't say for sure, that a lot of them were, of the people who were released, were common criminals, murderers and so on, who were released under the idea that we're letting you go, but we're giving you a gun and you're going to work for us. So they're not, maybe might necessarily be Alawite, but you know, the reason they bought their, the regime bought their loyalty by letting them go in order to work, to do things like, you know, carry out massacres and that. A point on the kind of the Iran-Syria-America issue. I sat down over a couple of days with a pretty high official in the Syrian Ministry for Foreign Affairs who served at the Syrian Embassy in DC on a couple of occasions. And he mentioned himself that he said that the relationship between Iran and Syria is quite unnatural and quite strange. And when he was sent to DC, to the embassy, he was told by his superiors, I guess, in the Syrian regime, to try and establish good relations with the American government in DC. And apparently the Americans said, well, yeah, this is great, we want good relations with Damascus. Our concern at the moment, this is back, I think, maybe 2006, 2007, our concern at the moment is the number of militants and extremists passing over the border into Iraq. And so the guy I know, the official, went back to Damascus and said, well, this is what the Americans want. And they managed, I understand at least, to try and tighten up the border as much as they could. He went back to DC and said, well, listen, okay, to the Americans, we've done as much as we can. You know, we want your help with education and business, and you know, we want to have a University of Denver campus or something in Damascus, or as they're doing in Dubai and in the Gulf. And apparently he got no response to that. So, you know, this is what he felt.
Well, I want to thank our three panelists for an enlightening, if not somewhat depressing, discussion. So please join us. Please be sure to come back. We'll start promptly at 3:30 with the next panel, which is what might a post-Assad Syria look like, and hopefully we'll end up on a bit more of a hopeful note this afternoon's proceedings. Thank you.